Hey everybody, welcome to Properties of Water. Water is a pretty special molecule and it's super important to biological organisms. A lot of the properties of water you can only understand if you understand a little bit of chemistry. So just a quick review, you might want to pause and answer these questions, do the Quizlet set and then come back and answer them, or you can follow along with me. So of the three types of bonds, ionic, covalent, and hydrogen, covalent bonds tend to be the strongest. That's not always the case. If you're in AP chemistry, kind of ignore what I'm saying, but for biology, it tends to be true. Because they're sharing electrons between each other and they both need them, so the atoms that are in that bond are holding each other really tightly. If the electrons in a covalent bond are not shared evenly, if the two atoms aren't perfect partners, then the molecule can become polar. And we'll talk about the significance of that with water, because water is a polar molecule. Other term that's important is that ionic molecules are going to separate in water, also known as dissociating. So salt, for example, NaCl is going to separate into Na plus and Cl minus. And that's going to be important for like electricity flow and some of the things. Ooh, okay. Normally in class I'd have you do an 8-tab foldable to write down the 8 properties of water on. You could do that if you feel like it, or you could just follow along. Okay, so first things first, water is polar. So that's its first special property, and that's the one that leads to all the other properties. So what it means, if I can get myself out of the way here, is that the oxygen pulls the electrons harder than the hydrogens because it's electronegative. So the oxygen is going to have a slightly negative charge, and the hydrogen is going to have a slightly positive charge, since the electrons, which are negative, are closer to the oxygen. That means that water is going to be able to do hydrogen bonding with other molecules. So like you can see down here in this other picture, the slightly positive hydrogen of one water molecule is going to be attracted to the slightly negative oxygen of another water molecule. So water is able to bond with itself, and that's something that we call cohesion. It's also able to bond with other things. So that's what we call adhesion. It just means water is really sticky because it's attracted to a ton of other molecules, but they do have to be polar molecules. So the fact that it can stick to itself leads to the second property, which is surface tension. That's why some organisms like this bacillus lizard, aka the Jesus lizard, are able to run on water. You've probably seen stick bugs in the pond. They're all able to live on top of the water because of its surface tension. It sticks to itself so strongly, it actually creates a surface. That's pretty different from other liquids. Okay, so let me move myself out of the way. Special properties 3 and 4. Capillary action means that water is able to pull itself up thin tubes because it's so sticky to itself and to the sides of vascular tissue of plants, for example. So it's super important for plants because it's how they're able to do transpiration. Water evaporates from the stomata at the top of the leaves, and it also climbs up the entire stem, so the whole plant can get water, not just part of the plant. That's super important. If you've ever had a glass of ice water, you know that water is also lower density as a solid, so ice floats. That's super important for living things because that means that lakes only freeze on the top, so all the aquatic organisms are able to live underneath that layer. Special properties 5 and 6. These are the ones that I've seen most asked about on the AP exam, so just pay special attention to these. So water has a high specific heat and a high heat of vaporization. You may remember those terms from Chem. If not, they just mean that water absorbs a lot of energy, heat, in other words, before the temperature actually changes, before it actually goes up like 1 degree Fahrenheit, and it takes a long time for water to evaporate. It has to absorb a lot of heat before it evaporates. That's super important for living things for 2 main reasons. The first one is that lakes and rivers, etc., don't change temperature or dry up very quickly so that aquatic organisms can have a stable ecosystem. The other important one, that this is the one that tends to get asked about, sweating. So because water absorbs a lot of heat, when you sweat, it takes a lot of heat, like off your forehead, for example, before it evaporates. So it has an incredible ability to cool you down. That's why it's super critical that we are made of so much water so that we can maintain our temperature homeostasis. Without that property of water, our sweat wouldn't cool us as much as it does. Okay, last two properties, pretty simple stuff. Water is an important solvent, so it dissolves a lot of things. One note about that is that like molecules dissolve other like molecules. So water is polar. That means it tends to dissolve other polar substances. If you remember about the cell membrane real quick, the phospholipid bilayer, the phospholipids have a polar head and nonpolar tails. The tails make up most of the membrane, and they are nonpolar or hydrophilic. So how does water get through the membrane? It has to go through what we call an aquaporin, a transmembrane pore, that is polar. So water is freely able to go into the cell, but only because it goes through that polar portal, not because it's able to go across the nonpolar membrane. So polar and nonpolar molecules are going to repel each other, just something to keep in mind. Last thing, water is an important buffer, so it resists changes in pH. Our blood is mostly water, for example, and it maintains its nice neutral pH despite all the molecules that get dissolved in our blood, our sugars, salts, etc. So we can maintain that nice neutral 7 pH for the most part in our blood, and organisms stay healthy. All right, hopefully that makes some sense. Ask me if you have questions.